What I knew about Vietnam was zero. I didn't know where it was located, what was going on there, or anything else.
And the cards came up that they needed a photographer, so I was the one that went. We were going to a place called Vietnam, and virtually no one had heard of it in those days.
We were operating off of the carrier. We were on the Valley Forge aircraft carrier. Suddenly we had the orders to relieve that squadron in Vietnam, which we did. And he didn't have any chance to really talk to anybody. The people that I relieved, the squadron commander that I relieved, I had about 30 minutes to talk to him while he was heading back to Okinawa, and that was it.
And he told us, I know you only have secret clearances, but what I'm about to tell you is top secret. And with that, he instructed us to pack our stuff up. We were on an airplane back to Okinawa that evening, and we would be on our way to Vietnam.
It was just another adventure at that time. I was 22 years old, single, you know. And they said, we're looking for volunteers with certain MOSs. Raised my hand, says, I can do that, where's Vietnam? But later on, significance started to dawn on me, or after I retired from the Marine Corps.
Operation Shoofly was really pretty interesting because when most people think about Marines in Vietnam, they automatically assume it's the ground troops that went in 1965. But we actually had Marine aviators, helicopter squadrons that started rotating into Vietnam in 1962 through 1965. These were the guys who literally were flying by the seat of their pants. They were making things up as they went. It was a lot of adapting, innovating, and learning how to fly under combat conditions.
So our missions that our pilots flew were designed to put the Vietnamese troops into appropriate landing zones, to evacuate them after these missions, to evacuate any wounded that were there, and then to resupply them there or at other outposts throughout the northern part of the country. It all was new. We had never been in an operation of that nature. We were all learning as we went along because the terrain was totally different from the South.
They were out there, you know, in conditions they had never flown under before, you know, monsoon conditions, some of the mountainous terrain. They were dealing with a different kind of enemy. So there really is a sense of pride in how they were able to adapt.
Navigating was interesting. Yeah, it was because all the tree lines look kind of the same, and you have to learn your way around.
It was very risky. I mean, HMM 362 literally had been flying 2 days when they had their first bird damaged by small arms fire and had to make an emergency landing. By the time HMM 362 rotated out, all 24 of their birds had been damaged by ground fire. You have to remember too, these helicopters were not armored at this point. That came a little bit later on.
So what we had Schmeissers and grease guns that were handheld. A number of our enlisted crew would lay in the belly with their M1s and shoot people.
Placing of machine guns on the port and starboard sides of the helicopter. They came up with mounts for the machine guns so they could, using the UH-34 Delta, it didn't have armament there, and so that gave them protection on both sides of the helicopter during operations.
Marine pilots are extremely dedicated, professional, and some could even say tend to be just a bit crazy sometimes in their conduct of operations, but they're always there for the troops on the ground.
The interesting thing to me about Shoofly is that this was, it really was the confirmation of the whole concept of vertical envelopment in a jungle setting and against an elusive guerrilla type enemy.
Colonel Archie Clapp was known as an innovator with helicopter tactics.
He took to flying above the rest of the helicopters and behind. He called it calling plays from the grandstand so he could see how things unfolded.
One was called the Eagle Flight, where he decided he, as the commanding officer, would fly higher than the other helicopters to be able to observe what was going on and keep some helicopters in reserve and call the shots more or less, like a quarterback, to put more troops in where more helicopters in where they were needed.
Nobody really knew what to expect as far as flying conditions went down there in the Delta area where we were at that time. And so they developed that. They developed their own tactics by touch and go. Okay, that one didn't work, let's try something else. Or that one worked, we'll stick with it.
He developed a tactic where they would fly in a different direction and only at the very last minutes, I believe he said 2 minutes out, change course and fly into the intended target. It would throw them off a little bit, give the Marines a chance to get in, let the other troops get out without receiving heavy fire.
He probably kept most of us alive, just because of his previous operational experience. I think at this stage of the game, he was probably in the running to be the Marine Aviator of the Year.
And the squadron became known as Archie's Angels. He was a forward thinker, he was innovative, he knew how to look at a problem and solve it, and that's what he did. In Soc Trang, living conditions were pretty basic, and it was an airfield that had been built by the Japanese in World War II. It was very, very small, and it was pretty primitive living conditions. Once they moved up towards Da Nang, it was much different. That airfield was in much better shape. They had 8,000 feet of runway, and actually the barracks and the places where they lived were pretty far separated from the airfield itself. So much better conditions.
The living conditions were great. Our cook, he was able to get food for us and my whole squadron. We got steaks a couple of times a week.
I do remember that we had extraordinary chow. They went out of their way. As I recall, we had grilled steaks almost every Sunday.
At one point, I got tired of eating steak. And for the next week, I counted the number of meals that we had steak, breakfast, dinner, and supper. And half of those meals we had steak served. When guys start turning down steak for hot dogs, you know there's something wrong.
That I participated in a groundbreaking operation, that it was a first for the Marine Corps, and I was part of it. That's, like I say, that's my claim to history, you know.
I think in terms of Vietnam, it was very important, and it's sort of the unsung mission. I mean, when we talk about Vietnam, we tend to talk about the battle for Hue, the battle for Khe Sanh, the hill fights, Con Thien, places like that. But we don't realize that so many of the lessons learned came from Shoo Fly. How do we get troops on the ground? How do we deal with ground fire from an elusive enemy? How do we deal with landing in some of the terrain that you find in Northern I Corps? Weather conditions. All that stuff came from Shoo Fly. You know, that's the first place they dealt with it. Operation Shoo Fly absolutely was considered a success. I mean, they were able to do what they came there to do. And not only did they do it, but they did it very well.
The fact that later on the Marines were able to get their own complement of Huey helicopters, and then the Apache, came out of concepts of tactics and strategy that were developed during Shoo Fly by those very innovative helicopter aviation pilots.
Shortly after arriving at Shoo Fly, I took a picture of a little girl in the village adjacent to Shoo Fly compound. The little girl was standing at the barbed wire fence that separated the compound from her village. And her right hand was extended and holding a strand of the barbed wire fence, and there was a tormented expression on her face. I've always thought that that particular picture expressed the Vietnam War. There was a separation between us. Call it the barbed wire fence or whatever it was. But in that little girl's face, I remember Vietnam, and I remember the difficulties that we had.
Oh, absolutely, I'm proud of that. Operations, that wasn't the biggest one because we were fighting the Viet Cong there. We weren't fighting the North Vietnamese as it turned out to be a later operation. But we were well pleased with what we had to do and how we did it.
It's a minor chapter in the history of the Marine Corps, but actually the history of the Marine Corps is made up of many minor chapters which all come together in a compendium to make the Marine Corps what it is, a unique fighting unit that fights with intelligence, integrity, and also compassion.